The sky over Germany burned with black smoke and falling metal. Captain Robert Mitchell gripped the controls of his P-51 Mustang fighter and watched another American bomber explode in midair. Pieces of the B-17 scattered across the clouds like deadly confetti. Somewhere inside that wreckage were 10 men who had eaten breakfast beside him that morning. Now, they were gone to IT was March 1944, and the war against Nazi Germany was not going well in the air. Every day, hundreds of American bombers flew deep into enemy territory to destroy factories and military targets. Every day, German fighters tore them apart. The Luftwaffe pilots were skilled, aggressive, and they had one huge advantage. They always knew the Americans were coming. Bobby pushed his throttle forward and dove toward a German Messerschmitt fighter that was lining up another shot at a crippled bomber. His machine guns roared to life, tracers streaking through the air. The German pilot saw him coming and rolled away, disappearing into a cloud bank. Bobby cursed under his breath. He had been flying escort missions for 8 months now, and it felt like they were losing more planes every week. The German radar network was the real enemy. From the moment American bombers crossed into occupied Europe, German radar stations tracked them. The information went straight to Luftwaffe command centers, where officers moved markers on maps like chess pieces. German fighters scrambled from airfields with plenty of time to climb to attack altitude. They positioned themselves perfectly, often attacking from above with the sun behind them. The American bombers never had a chance to hide. Bobby's squadron leader, Major Richard Hayes, called the formation back together. 15 P-51 Mustangs had taken off from England that morning. Now only 12 remained. 3 pilots were either dead or prisoners of war. The surviving bombers turned west, trailing smoke and struggling to stay airborne. Bobby took his position and began the long flight home across France and over the English Channel. Back at the airbase in southern England, mechanics swarmed over damaged aircraft. Medics carried wounded men to the hospital tent. Bobby climbed out of his cockpit and felt his legs shake. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by exhaustion and anger. He had shot down 1 German fighter today, but it did not feel like a victory. Not when so many bombers failed to return. The debriefing room smelled of cigarette smoke and coffee. Pilots sat in wooden chairs, their flight suits stained with oil and sweat. Major Hayes stood at the front beside a large map of Europe covered with red marks, showing where aircraft had been lost. Each mark represented a crew that would never fly again. "The Germans are getting better at intercepting us," Major Hayes said, his voice flat and tired. "Their radar picks us up the moment we cross the coast. Their fighters are waiting at altitude by the time we reach the target. We need to find a new approach, or we're going to lose this air war." Bobby stared at the map and felt something click in his mind. Every mission followed the same pattern. Bombers flew high at 20,000 feet or more, where the air was thin and cold. Fighter escorts surrounded them in protective formations. German radar tracked the massive formations from 100 miles away. Luftwaffe fighters climb high and attack from above. Every single time, the same pattern. That night, Bobby could not sleep. He lay in his bunk and thought about the farm where he grew up in Kansas. His father had been a crop duster pilot, flying old biplanes low over wheat fields to spray pesticide. Bobby remembered riding in the front seat as a boy, watching the ground flash past just below the wheels. His father had told him something important. When you fly low, Bobby, you are invisible. Nobody sees you coming until you are right on top of them. The idea seemed crazy at first. American doctrine said altitude was safety. Height gave pilots room to maneuver, time to react, space to escape if something went wrong. Flying low was what you did when you were already in trouble, desperately trying to hide from enemy fighters. But what if they flew low on purpose? What if they went in so low that German radar could not track them? Bobby sat up in his bunk and grabbed a notebook. He began sketching routes across France and Germany, following valleys and rivers where aircraft could hide between hills. The more he thought about it, the more sense it made. German radar was designed to spot high-altitude formations. Their fighters practiced attacking from above. Their anti-aircraft guns were calibrated for bombers at 20,000 feet. Nobody expected American aircraft to come screaming in at treetop level. The next morning, Bobby requested a meeting with Major Hayes. The major looked skeptical as Bobby spread maps across his desk and explained the idea. Flying at 50 or 100 feet above the ground, following terrain to avoid radar, hitting targets before the Germans even knew they were coming. You will get everyone killed, Major Hayes said bluntly. One mistake at that altitude and you crash. Engine trouble means no time to bail out. German anti-aircraft guns will have easier shots. This is suicide. With respect, sir, we are dying anyway, Bobby replied. We lost 3 bombers today, 2 yesterday, for the day before. The Germans always see us coming. We need to change the game. Major Hayes studied the young pilot for a long moment. Bobby was 24 years old with 32 combat missions under his belt. He had shot down 7 German aircraft and earned a reputation as one of the squadron's best pilots. He was also right about the losses. Something had to change. You get 6 volunteers, Major Hayes finally said. Test the theory on one mission. If it works, we expand the program. If you get everyone killed, I will personally ensure your name is remembered as the man who came up with the stupidest idea in Air Force history. Bobby grinned. I will take those odds, sir. Word spread quickly through the squadron. Flying at treetop level sounded absolutely insane, which meant it was exactly the kind of mission that attracted certain types of pilots. By evening, Bobby had more volunteers than he needed. He chose 5 carefully. Each one needed to be skilled, steady under pressure, and just crazy enough to think this might actually work. The most important thing was that they had to trust each other completely. At treetop level, there would be no room for error and no second chances. The morning briefing room felt different when only 7 pilots gathered instead of the usual 30. Bobby Mitchell stood at the front and looked at the faces of the men and one woman who had volunteered for what everyone else called a suicide mission. These were the people who would help him prove that flying low could change the war. Lieutenant Tommy Rodriguez sat in the front row, grinning like this was the best day of his life. Tommy had flown with Bobby since training school in Texas. He was a natural pilot who could make a P-51 Mustang dance through the sky like it was part of his own body. Tommy had grown up in New Mexico, flying his uncle's crop duster during summer breaks. He understood low-level flying better than anyone else in the squadron. Next to Tommy sat Lieutenant Sarah Chun, the only female combat pilot Bobby had ever met. Sarah had joined the Women Air Force Service Pilots program in 1942, ferrying aircraft across the United States. She had logged more flight hours than most male pilots, but was not supposed to fly combat missions. Through connections and determination, she had managed to transfer to England and somehow convince command to let her fly. Sarah was quiet and methodical, the kind of pilot who never made mistakes because she thought 3 steps ahead. The other 4 volunteers were equally impressive. Lieutenant James Parker was a farmer's son from Iowa who could read terrain like a book. Sergeant Michael O'Brien had been a stunt pilot before the war and loved flying inverted just for fun. Captain David Martinez was the oldest at 32, a veteran of the North African campaign who had survived being shot down twice. And Lieutenant William Chun, Sarah's cousin, was the squadron's best navigator who could find any target with just a map and a compass. Gentlemen and lady, Bobby began, what we are about to attempt has never been done before. The Army Air Force does not have procedures for this kind of flying because everyone thinks it is impossible. We are going to prove them wrong. He unrolled a map of southern England and pointed to various landmarks. For the next 2 weeks, we train every single day. We learn to fly at 100 feet or lower. We practice following rivers and valleys. We memorize terrain features until we can navigate without looking at maps. Most importantly, we learn to trust each other completely because at this altitude, one mistake kills everyone around you. Major Hayes had given them permission to use a section of English countryside for training. Local farmers were not happy about American fighter planes screaming over their fields at dawn, but this was wartime and nobody asked for permission. The real challenge was learning to think differently about flying. Every pilot had been trained that altitude equals safety. Height gave you options. If your engine quit at 20,000 feet, you had minutes to restart it or find a place to crash land. At 100 feet, engine failure meant you had about 3 seconds before hitting the ground. There was no margin for error, no time to think, only time to react. The first training flight was terrifying for everyone. Bobby led the formation across the English countryside at 50 feet, and his heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. Trees and buildings flashed past his wingtips. A church steeple rose ahead, and he had to bank hard to avoid it. Behind him, the other pilots struggled to maintain formation while avoiding obstacles that appeared with no warning. Tommy nearly crashed into a barn when a farmer's truck pulled onto a road right in front of him. Sarah clipped the top branches of an oak tree and returned to base with leaves stuck in her air intake. Michael O'Brien actually flew under a railway bridge, showing off his stunt pilot skills, which earned him a sharp lecture from Bobby about unnecessary risks. But they learned. Every day they flew a little smoother, reacted a little faster, trusted their instincts a little more. Bobby developed hand signals for formation changes since radio silence would be essential over enemy territory. A raised fist meant climb immediately. A flat hand meant level off. A chopping motion meant break formation and scatter. They practiced navigating by terrain features instead of instruments. Rivers became highways that led straight to targets. Valleys offered protection from radar. Forests provided cover during the final approach. Bobby made everyone memorize the route to their first target until they could fly it blindfolded. The local farmers began complaining to the base commander about cows that stopped producing milk because of the noise. Sheep scattered in panic whenever the fighters roared overhead. One farmer claimed his chickens refused to lay eggs anymore. Major Hayes told the farmers this was war and their cows would have to deal with temporary stress. Privately, he told Bobby to try flying routes that avoided livestock when possible. After a week of training, Bobby gathered the team for a night flight. If they were going to hit targets deep in enemy territory, they needed to fly in darkness as well as daylight. Night flying at treetop level was even more dangerous because you could not see obstacles until they were right in front of you. The pilots relied on moonlight and instinct, following roads and rivers that showed up as darker lines against darker ground. Sarah proved to be the best night flyer. Her methodical nature meant she never rushed, never panicked, and always thought ahead. She taught the others her techniques for reading shadows and identifying landmarks in darkness. Tommy joked that she had cat eyes, which made Sarah smile, a rare thing for the serious pilot. By the end of 2 weeks, the 7 pilots had transformed into a precision unit. They could fly formation at 50 feet, navigate by terrain alone, and react to obstacles instantly. They had developed their own language of hand signals and wing movements. They trusted each other with their lives because they had no other choice. Major Hayes watched their final training run from the control tower. The 7P-51 Mustangs streaked across the airfield in perfect formation, so low that their propeller wash kicked up dust from the runway. They broke formation, scattered around imaginary threats, regrouped, and landed without a single mistake. They are either the bravest pilots I have ever seen or the craziest, Major Hayes said to his operations officer. Tomorrow we find out which. The mission briefing was scheduled for dawn. Their target was a German fuel depot near the French border. Intelligence reports said it was lightly defended because the Germans never expected low-level attacks that deep in occupied territory. If Bobby and his team succeeded, they would prove that American ingenuity could overcome German radar. If they failed, 7 of the squadron's best pilots would die for nothing. The dawn air tasted like metal and fuel. Bobby Mitchell walked across the airfield toward his P-51 Mustang, while ground crews made final checks on 7 aircraft. Each plane carried 2 500-pound bombs under the wings and a full load of ammunition. The mission was simple on paper. Fly 300 miles into occupied France at treetop level, destroy a German fuel depot, and return home before the Luftwaffe figured out what happened. Sarah Chun was already in her cockpit, running through pre-flight checks with the same careful attention she brought to everything. Tommy Rodriguez bounced on his toes beside his aircraft, too excited to stand still. The other 4 pilots showed various levels of nervous energy. Everyone understood that this mission would either prove Bobby's theory or get them all killed. Major Hayes walked over and handed Bobby a sealed envelope. "Reconnaissance photos from yesterday," he said quietly. "The depot has 16 large fuel storage tanks. Intelligence estimates enough gasoline to supply German tank divisions for 2 months. If you succeed, you will hurt their supply chain badly. If you fail, I lose 7 good pilots for nothing." "We will not fail, sir," Bobby replied with more confidence than he felt. The 7 Mustangs took off in darkness, climbing to 5,000 feet for the journey across the English Channel. Bobby looked back at the formation behind him. 6 aircraft held perfect position, their exhaust flames visible in the pre-dawn gloom. Once they crossed into occupied territory, they would drop to treetop level and radio silence. From that moment on, they would be completely alone. The French coast appeared as a dark line against slightly less dark water. Bobby pushed the control stick forward and dove toward the waves. His altimeter unwound rapidly as the Mustang dropped. 5,000 feet became 1,000, then 500, then 100. At 50 feet above the water, Bobby leveled off. Sea spray hit his windscreen. The other 6 planes followed him down, spreading into a loose formation. They crossed the beach at full throttle, sand dunes flashing past below. Bobby pulled up slightly to clear a line of trees and then dropped back down on the other side. France spread out before them in the gray light of early morning. Fields and forests, roads and rivers, all passing beneath their wings at 300 miles per hour. The first German they encountered was a soldier smoking a cigarette beside a truck on a country road. The man looked up at the sound of engines, and his mouth fell open in shock. 7 American fighters roared over his head, so low that the propeller wash knocked off his helmet. By the time he could raise an alarm, they were already 5 miles away. Bobby led the formation up a river valley, the water gleaming silver below them. This was the critical part. German radar stations were scanning for high-altitude bombers, their beams sweeping the sky above 10,000 feet. Down here in the valleys and forests, they were invisible. Birds scattered in panic as the Mustangs thundered past. A farmer driving a wagon dove into a ditch. They flew past a small German airfield, and Bobby resisted the urge to attack it. Their mission was the fuel depot, not random targets of opportunity. Besides, the Germans at that airfield had no idea American aircraft were even in the area. They would learn about this raid from reports later, which was exactly the point. Surprise was everything. 20 minutes in occupied territory, and not a single German fighter had scrambled to intercept them. No anti-aircraft fire reached up from the ground. No radar had detected their approach. Bobby allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe this crazy idea would actually work. Lieutenant William Chun, flying as navigator in the number 2 position, signaled with hand gestures. 2 minutes to target. Bobby acknowledged and tightened his formation. All 7 aircraft moved closer together, wingtips almost touching. They came around a forested hill, and there it was. The German fuel depot sat in a valley, hidden from high-altitude observation by surrounding hills, but completely visible to anyone flying at ground level. 16 massive cylindrical storage tanks arranged in neat rows, each one painted with camouflage patterns. A few small buildings housed guards and workers. One German soldier was walking between tanks, probably on morning patrol. He never looked up. Bobby raised his fist, the signal to arm weapons. He counted to 3, then chopped his hand forward. Attack point 7P, 51 Mustangs screamed across the valley at full power. The German guard heard them and turned, his face a mask of confusion and terror. American aircraft? Here? Impossible. But impossible things were happening all around him now. Bobby's thumb pressed the bomb release. 2 500-pound bombs fell away from his wings, arcing down toward the fuel tanks. Behind him, 12 more bombs fell from the other aircraft. The Mustangs roared across the depot in seconds, already climbing and turning for the escape route. The first explosion came as a deep, thunderous boom that shook the earth. A fuel tank ruptured and burning gasoline vomited into the sky. The second explosion was bigger, a massive fireball that rose hundreds of feet. Chain reactions began as intense heat ignited neighboring tanks. Within 30 seconds, the entire depot was a raging inferno. Bobby looked back and saw a mushroom cloud of black smoke rising from the valley. Flames reflected off the clouds above. The heat was so intense that he could feel it in his cockpit, even though they were already a mile away. Millions of gallons of irreplaceable German fuel burned, turning into useless smoke. They raced back across France at treetop level, following a different route to avoid any German forces that might have been alerted. Tommy flew so close to Bobby's wing that he could see his friend grinning behind the oxygen mask. Sarah maintained perfect position despite the turbulence from all the aircraft flying so close together. The four others held formation like they had been doing this for years instead of weeks. They passed a German convoy on a road, and the soldiers barely had time to look up before the Mustangs were gone. They flew under power lines, over farmhouses, through morning fog that hung in valleys. 100 miles from the target, Bobby finally allowed himself to believe they would make it home. The English Channel appeared ahead, gray water under gray clouds. Bobby led the formation up to 5,000 feet and finally broke radio silence. Barnstormer lead to home base. Mission successful. All aircraft returning. Major Hayes's voice crackled back immediately. Outstanding work, Barnstormers. Reconnaissance confirms target destroyed. Welcome home. They landed at the English air base to find mechanics and pilots lining the runway, cheering and waving. Ground crews rushed forward to examine the aircraft. Not a single bullet hole. Not one damaged plane. 7 pilots had flown 300 miles into enemy territory, destroyed a critical target, and returned without a scratch. That night, intelligence reports confirmed the fuel depot had been completely destroyed. German tank divisions in France would have to wait weeks for replacement fuel. More importantly, Luftwaffe High Command was scrambling to understand how American aircraft had appeared deep in occupied territory without any radar warning. Bobby sat in the officers' club and raised a glass with his team. They had proven it was possible. They had changed the rules of aerial warfare. And tomorrow, they would do it again. News of the Barnstormers spread through the Allied air forces like wildfire. Bobby Mitchell and his team flew 12 more successful missions over the next 2 months, hitting bridges, ammunition dumps, railway stations, and supply convoys. Each mission used the same tactic. Fly low, stay invisible to radar, strike fast, and disappear before the Germans could react. They had not lost a single aircraft. Other squadrons began training for treetop-level attacks. By May 1944, dozens of American pilots were flying low across occupied Europe, appearing from nowhere to destroy German targets. The Luftwaffe was in chaos, trying to defend against threats they could not see coming. German radar operators filed reports of Allied aircraft that seemed to vanish from their screens, only to reappear after striking targets hundreds of miles away. But the Germans were not stupid. They began to adapt. Luftwaffe commanders studied the pattern of low-level attacks and made changes. They positioned fighters at lower altitudes near likely targets. They trained anti-aircraft gun crews to watch for movement at ground level instead of just scanning the sky. They strung steel cables across narrow valleys where aircraft might fly. In church towers and on hilltops, they placed observers with binoculars and radios. Bobby knew the Germans were adapting, but he did not know how much until the 15th mission. The target was a railway yard in Belgium where German supply trains assembled before heading to the front lines. Intelligence reported light defenses and no unusual activity. It looked like another perfect target for a lightning strike. The morning was overcast with low clouds, perfect weather for treetop flying. Bobby led 8 aircraft this time, having added 1 more pilot to the team. They crossed into Belgium at dawn, following a river valley that led straight toward the target. Everything seemed normal. Villages passed below. Farmers working in fields barely looked up anymore, having grown used to the sound of aircraft 0.5 miles from the railway yard. Bobby saw the first warning sign. A German observation post on a hill fired a red flare into the sky. The flare hung in the air, burning bright crimson. That was a signal, but for what? Stay sharp, Bobby said over the radio, breaking silence. Something felt wrong. They came around a forested ridge, and the railway yard appeared below. Dozens of trains sat on parallel tracks, exactly as the intelligence photos had shown. Bobby prepared to give the attack signal when Sarah Chin's urgent voice crackled through his headphones. Fighters. Low altitude, 3 o'clock. Bobby snapped his head right, and his blood went cold. 6 German Focke-Wulf fighters were diving toward them from the clouds, but not from high altitude like usual. These fighters had been waiting at low altitude, hidden in the overcast. The trap had been perfectly set. Break formation. Scatter, Bobby shouted, but even as he banked hard left, he knew they were in serious trouble. At treetop level, there was no room to dive away from attackers. They could only turn and try to outmaneuver the enemy fighters in the narrow space between ground and clouds. The sky erupted in chaos. German cannon fire tore through the air. Bobby's Mustang shuddered as bullets stitched across his left wing. He rolled right, nearly clipping a farmhouse roof, and came up behind a Focke-Wulf. His machine guns hammered, and the German fighter broke away, trailing smoke. Tommy Rodriguez was in trouble. 2 German fighters had him boxed in, firing from both sides. Tommy flew between 2 trees, so close that his wings had inches of clearance on each side. 1 German pilot tried to follow and clipped a branch. His fighter cartwheeled across a field, and a ball of fire, anti-aircraft fire, suddenly filled the sky. Hidden gun positions around the railway yard opened up, having waited for the American aircraft to get close. Tracer rounds created a deadly web of fire. Bobby realized with sickening clarity that the Germans had used the railway yard as bait. They knew the Americans would come, and they had prepared a killing zone. Head for the river gorge, Bobby ordered, thinking fast. Single file, tight formation. He banked hard toward a narrow gorge where a river cut through rocky hills. It was a dangerous route, even for experienced pilots, but the heavier German fighters would not be able to follow through such tight spaces. The Barnstormers had one advantage. They had been flying at treetop level for months. This was their specialty. Bobby dove into the gorge with his throttle wide open. Rock walls flashed past on both sides, so close he could see individual stones. Behind him, 7 other Mustangs followed in a line, each pilot trusting the one ahead completely. The sound of their engines echoed off the walls like rolling thunder. The German fighter tried to follow. Bobby saw it in his mirror, diving into the gorge entrance. The pilot was skilled and brave, but he was used to fighting at altitude where there was room for error. At 50 feet above a river, there was no room for anything except perfect control. The German's wingtip caught the rock wall. It was just a small impact, barely a touch, but at 300 miles per hour it was enough. The fighter exploded against the gorge wall, raining burning debris into the river below. The gorge twisted left and Bobby banked hard, his wingtip 5 feet from solid rock. Another twist right. The river dropped over a small waterfall, and Bobby had to pull up sharply to clear it, then drop back down immediately. Behind him, the other Mustangs followed every move perfectly. Then Bobby heard the sound that every pilot feared. Engine coughing. He looked back and saw white smoke streaming from Tommy's Mustang. The fighter fire had damaged something critical. Tommy's engine was dying. "I am losing power," Tommy said calmly over the radio. "Not going to make it home." Bobby's heart sank. They were still deep in enemy territory, 40 miles from friendly lines. If Tommy bailed out here, he would be captured immediately. "Stay with us," Bobby ordered. "We will get you across the border." But even as he spoke, he knew it was probably impossible. Tommy's engine was running rougher, smoke getting thicker. The Mustang was losing altitude, unable to maintain height even at full throttle. They emerged from the gorge into open farmland. Behind them, no German fighters followed. The trap had failed to destroy them, but the cost was becoming clear. Tommy's aircraft was dying in the air, and they still had to cross 40 miles of enemy territory to reach safety. Lieutenant William Chun pulled up alongside Tommy's smoking fighter, checking the damage. "Your coolant system is hit," he reported. "Engine will seize up in minutes." Sarah Chun moved to Tommy's other wing, taking up escort position. Without speaking, all 8 pilots had made the same decision. They would not leave Tommy behind. If his aircraft went down, they would all circle and protect him until rescue could be arranged, even if it meant getting shot down themselves. That Tommy's engine made a grinding sound and more smoke poured out. But the young pilot from New Mexico kept flying, nursing every bit of power from the dying aircraft. The Belgian border was ahead, marked on Bobby's map as a thin line between enemy and friendly territory. Just 30 more miles. Then 20. Then 10. Tommy's propeller was barely turning now, the blades windmilling slowly as the engine gave up. His Mustang was gliding more than flying, trading altitude for distance. They were so close to safety, but not close enough. "I'm going down," Tommy said quietly. His aircraft dropped lower, skimming over trees. Ahead was an open field behind Allied lines. Maybe, just maybe, he could reach it. Tommy Rodriguez's crippled Mustang cleared the last line of trees and dropped into a field behind Allied lines. The aircraft hit hard, bounced once, and slid across muddy ground in a shower of dirt and torn metal. The right landing gear collapsed, and the fighter spun sideways before coming to rest against a hedgerow. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the canopy flew open and Tommy climbed out, waving his arms to show he was alive. Bobby Mitchell circled overhead with the other 6 barnstormers, watching until Allied troops reached Tommy's position. Relief flooded through him. They had lost an aircraft, but not the pilot. Tommy would fly again, though it would take weeks for him to recover from the rough landing that had broken his left leg and 3 ribs. Back at base in England, Bobby sat across from Major Hayes and prepared for the difficult conversation. The trap in Belgium had been too perfectly arranged. The Germans now understood the treetop tactic and were adapting their defenses. Future missions would be more dangerous, casualties higher. Some officers were already suggesting that low-level attacks had run their course. "We should go back to high-altitude escort," Major Hayes said, lighting a cigarette. "You prove the tactic works, but now the Germans are ready for it. I cannot justify losing more pilots." Bobby had expected this reaction. He had spent the entire flight home thinking about the problem and the solution. "Sir, I think we're looking at this wrong. The Germans have not figured out how to stop us. They have just split their defenses." He spread a map across the desk and pointed to various locations. "Look at what has happened since we started flying low. The Luftwaffe has to keep fighters at both high and low altitude. Their radar network is less effective because we proved it has blind spots. Every gun crew watching for treetop attacks is a gun crew not shooting at our bombers flying at 20,000 feet." Major Hayes leaned forward, interested. "Go on. We use both tactics together," Bobby explained. "Let my squadron and others keep hitting targets at low level. Keep the Germans guessing. Force them to defend everywhere at once. Meanwhile, bomber formations hit their primary targets with fewer losses because German defenses are spread thin." The strategy made sense. Germany was already struggling to defend its territory against around-the-clock bombing from both American and British forces. If they had to defend against threats from all altitudes simultaneously, their air defense system would collapse under the strain. Within a week, Bobby's proposal went up the chain of command and came back approved. The Barnstormers would continue low-level missions, but now as part of a coordinated strategy. When heavy bomber formations attacked industrial targets at high altitude, treetop squadrons would simultaneously hit supply lines and airfields at ground level. The Germans would have to choose which threat to defend against, and either choice meant something would get through. Over the next 6 months, the tactic proved devastating. German commanders scrambled to defend everywhere at once and succeeded nowhere. Their fighter forces burned fuel patrolling at multiple altitudes. Radar stations tried to track threats both high and low, missing many of both. Anti-aircraft batteries that had been optimized for high-altitude targets struggled to engage treetop aircraft flashing past at 300 miles per hour. Bobby continued leading missions, though the danger never decreased. The Germans learned to predict likely low-level routes and position defenses accordingly. Cables stretched across valleys claimed several aircraft. Alert observers in church towers sometimes gave enough warning for fighters to intercept. Bobby lost 3 pilots over those 6 months, and each loss hurt like a personal failure. But the strategic impact was undeniable. Allied intelligence estimated that low-level attacks destroyed or damaged over 200 trains, 50 bridges, hundreds of supply trucks, and countless tons of ammunition and fuel. More importantly, the psychological effect on German forces was enormous. Soldiers never knew when American fighters might appear from nowhere, screaming over their positions at treetop level. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, became defensive and reactive instead of aggressive. Sarah Chun became an instructor in early 1945, teaching new pilots the art of ground-level navigation. She had survived 38 low-level missions without a scratch, and her methodical approach saved countless lives. Young pilots learned from her that staying alive at treetop altitude required thinking 3 steps ahead and never, ever panicking. Tommy Rodriguez returned to combat after recovering from his injuries. He flew with a slight limp for the rest of his life, but his skills had not diminished. If anything, surviving a crash had made him more confident. He flew 20 more missions before the war ended, earning a Distinguished Flying Cross for shooting down 3 German jets during the Battle of the Bulge. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Nazi Germany surrendered, crushed between advancing Allied armies and unrelenting air attacks that had destroyed their ability to produce war materials. The treetop tactics pioneered by pilots like Bobby Mitchell had played a small but significant role in that victory. Bobby returned to Kansas after the war and never spoke much about his combat experience. He married his childhood sweetheart, took over his father's crop dusting business, and lived a quiet life flying low over wheat fields. Sometimes young pilots would visit, asking questions about the legendary Barnstormers. Bobby would answer their questions honestly, but always emphasize the men who did not come home. "We did not win the war by being brave," he told one young Air Force pilot in 1960. "We won because we adapted faster than the enemy. The Germans were skilled and disciplined, but they expected us to fight their way. When we changed the rules and flew lower than anyone thought possible, we took away their advantages." Military historians studied the treetop tactics for decades after the war. They concluded that the innovation represented a turning point in aerial warfare. Before the Barnstormers, everyone assumed radar had made surprise air attacks obsolete. High-flying bombers would always be detected and intercepted. Bobby and his team proved that assumption wrong by going where radar could not see them. Modern attack helicopters and low-flying strike aircraft owe their existence to those World War II pilots who first discovered that sometimes the best way to avoid being shot down is to fly so low that the enemy cannot see you coming. The terrain following systems in today's military aircraft are sophisticated versions of what Bobby Mitchell did with just his eyes and instinct. In 1985, the surviving Barnstormers gathered for a reunion at the Air Force Museum in Ohio. Only 5 of the original team were still alive. Bobby, now 65 years old with gray hair and reading glasses, stood before a restored P-51 Mustang painted with the Barnstormer insignia. Sarah Chun, still sharp and precise at 63, stood beside him. Tommy Rodriguez was there too, walking with his permanent limp but grinning as widely as he had during the war. They remembered the friends who did not survive. Lieutenant James Parker, killed over France in October 1944 when his aircraft struck a power line. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, shot down defending a crippled bomber. Captain David Martinez, who died when his damaged fighter crashed shore to the English coast. Each name was honored, each sacrifice remembered. "We were just ordinary pilots," Bobby said to the crowd of young airmen gathered to hear their stories. "We were scared most of the time. We made mistakes. But we were willing to try something new when the old methods were not working. That is the real lesson. Never be afraid to think differently, even when everyone else says you are crazy." The museum's P-51 Mustang gleamed under the lights, a reminder of a time when young pilots flew lower than anyone thought possible and changed how wars are fought in the sky. The Barnstormers were never as famous as the bomber crews or the fighter aces who shot down dozens of enemy aircraft. but they proved that innovation and courage could overcome any technological advantage. Bobby Mitchell died in 1992 at age 72, flying his crop duster until the very end. He was buried with full military honors, and 3P-51 Mustangs flew low over his funeral, dropping flowers in tribute. The formation flew at exactly 50 feet, treetop level, the way Bobby would have wanted it. His legacy lived on in every military pilot trained to use terrain for cover, in every attack helicopter flying low through valleys, in every strike aircraft that appears from nowhere to hit targets before defenses can react. The sky had no limits, Bobby and the Barnstormers had proved, as long as you were brave enough to fly where others feared to go.